Okay, so this is me. I'm going to talk about implementation science for an hour, I guess, is in the program. I will start by telling that there are PhD programs in implementation science. We run a short course on implementation science, which is 5 full weeks. I usually do workshops no less than a day on implementation science because I find it hard to fit even the basics in a day. So if you find that I rush things, remember that it's an hour. Most people who call me and my colleagues who do implementation science, they call us and say, can you come and tell us how to implement things? And I would say all of us would respond, no, we can't do that. Because there's not enough knowledge or evidence available to say how do you implement things. This is a quite new area, even though we have plenty of historical examples where implementation has not worked. And I was talking to you yesterday, some of you yesterday, and you are giving the same experience, sharing the same experience that implementation is really, really tricky. But I will still try and give you an introduction to implementation. Because we use this word a lot. And it's sort of a buzzword, and everyone wants to say that we've implemented this and we've implemented that. But in the end of the day, very little is really implemented. And I will talk about that and share with you why I say that. This is a sponge cake. And the sponge cake will follow us. And I'm sorry for my English, it's not fluent, but I'll do my best. So the sponge cake will follow us for the next hour. Have you all do you know what a sponge cake is? Yes. Have you done it? Yes. Everyone? Yes. Some have not made a sponge cake. Have you been baking at all? Have you done any kind of baking? Yes. Okay, so even though who has not made a sponge cake, you have done some kind of baking so that you can relate to my example that will do as hopefully help you understand why I'm talking about implementation science and sponge cake in the same sentence. Implementation science is really about understanding what is it that works, for whom does it work, where does it work, and why does it work, or why does it not work. And implementation science, you can implement a lot of things. Many people like to say, I've implemented this and I've implemented that, as I said before. But when we talk implementation science, we are interested in knowledge implementation. And if you look at the literature, you will find a number of words used for this. It could be knowledge translation, it could be knowledge transfer, and it could be knowledge implementation. And that's what we're interested in, because we're not interested in just anything. I assume that people are going to get my slides. Is that correct? Yeah. Yes. Have you already got them? No. Okay. Because I was wondering if anybody had been sneaking into them and seeing, like, what's the sponge cake recipe doing in there? This is a sponge cake recipe. And this is how you do it. And this is usually, and I'm really, really sorry that I wasn't here yesterday, because I would probably have been able to see whether when you were given directions or guidance as in how to implement the guidelines, this is probably what you got. This is how you do it. You melt the butter and you set it aside to cool. This is how you start a sponge cake. So you take 50 grams of butter, melt that, put that aside. You take 2 eggs, 2 deciliters of sugar, beat that together. You add milk and you mix flour and baking powder. And once you mix that, you put that into the batter that you have, and then in the end you put the butter in, which is now cool and nice, and you pour that into a coated cake pan and you bake in the oven for 35 to 40 minutes in a temperature of about 175 degrees. Okay, this is how you do it. This is probably what you got. This is how you implement the guidelines. This is how you do it. We're going to look at why that's not enough, according to us. Okay? Questions so far? No?
You're hoping it will rise.
Yeah, you're hoping it will rise. That's the key point. You're hoping for something to happen. Am I standing too far away from the microphone? Okay, good. So some basic ideas. As I said, a lot of people talk about implementation. Implementation means carry out, accomplish. When is it carried out? When is it accomplished? It's when people who are supposed to use it fully and not something else. So if you think about it, how many times do you actually implement things? And more often, do you diffuse or disseminate things? Because that's what you do. Others implement. And most of the time we think that others should do something. They should implement. They should recognize. I started doing quality improvement 25 years ago when I was in intensive care. I tried to implement evidence-based practice the best I could. I tried, and I banged my head against the wall so hard that I needed to cut bangs because I kind of look funny on my forehead. Then I thought to myself, what is it that I do wrong? So I took my master's in pedagogy because I thought that, okay, if I just learn how to teach better, they will listen to me and do what I suggest that they do. And that is, they would implement the evidence that I suggested is providing for good practice. That didn't work. They didn't implement more because I was a better teacher. I hopefully was a better teacher at least. So I thought to myself, why don't I do a PhD program? Because once I'm a doctor, they will listen to me. So I took my PhD program. I did a thesis on patient participation. And I was then quite qualified in teaching. And then also I had the level of being able to bang people in the head saying that, listen to me, I did a thesis on this. People didn't implement more because of my thesis, my PhD level. So I actually moved into implementation science about 10 years ago. And for me, it was like coming home. I'm living proof that it takes 10,000 hours to become good at something that you want to do. So if you think that you're going to learn implementation science in 1 hour, sorry, it takes 10,000 hours to become good at it. And it was like coming home because by then I realized, why is it so hard? Why is it that it's not about me, that others do not implement? And I started to look at myself, what have I implemented in my life in terms of evidence that is actually better practice? And I came down with one thing that I have implemented in my life. It's Brussels sprouts. Brussels sprouts is good for you. And that's the one and only thing I've been able to implement myself. which means that I have actually changed. I now eat Brussels sprouts. I've changed. And why do I eat Brussels sprouts? Because they're good for you. They contain a lot of ingredients that's good for you. What have I de-implemented in the same time? Nothing. I still eat way too much candy, even though I know it's not good for me. I cut down, so I only eat it on weekends, but then I eat a lot more. So I haven't really de-implemented very much, which means that I only added to my workload, if that would be in practice. So diffusion is what we normally do when we talk about implementation. We share things and say that, okay, I've implemented. No, you haven't. You diffused it. You share the information that you have. And you hope that others will adopt it or implement it. Dissemination is a more advanced level of diffusion, because dissemination is about purposely sharing, communicating the information to a point that you can actually say that you have increased someone else's knowledge. The adoption happens in the person who receives the message, the information. The first level of implementation is having a positive attitude and a decision to change the personal routine. But implementation is about changing attitudes and behaviors, and that is tricky. We're not very change-oriented, even though we'd like to say that we are. But think about it again. What have you implemented in your own life? It may not be Brussels sprouts. It may be something else. But what have you managed yourself to actually take up information and change in terms of knowledge as adults? As kids, we do it a lot. But as adults, what have you really implemented in your life? Implementation science is the study of methods to promote the integration of research findings and evidence into healthcare policy and practice. That's quoted from the NIH 2 years ago. And as I said, it's a growing field of evidence, or science, sorry. So we are growing as a society, but we are also learning a lot more about what's known, not known, and known out there. Looking back at history, Machiavelli in 1513 wrote in his book, The Prince, "Let it be noted that there is no more delicate matter to take in hand, nor more dangerous to conduct, nor more doubtful in its success than to set up as a leader in the introduction of changes." 1513. When we talk about implementation science, we need to understand that since it's a fairly young discipline, we need to understand where it comes from. We need to understand that in order to understand where did we borrow from, but also how come that it's so tricky to understand implementation. Because this is not borrowed just because, but it's rather borrowed because we have, so far learned that this is actually what can help us understand what happens, to whom does it happen, where does it happen, why doesn't it happen, or why does it happen? What is it that works for whom, in what context, to be short? And if we look at this, it looks like, probably to you it looks like, okay, a number of theories, right? But if we look at a couple of them, we will find that they can actually correspond to your daily practice. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. If you believe that if I'm going to implement things, when you start that thinking, I'm going to implement things, and I'm trying so hard now to sort of get my brain to go back to yesterday and understanding what did you really say, why isn't it happening, why is it happening. So let's take a couple of them. We take the one on the very far right, reimbursement theories. That's what stakeholders, politicians, and decision makers usually think is the key to get people to do the right thing, which is implementing the new evidence. It could be, for example, that they come to your hospital and say that, okay, if you implement the guidelines, if you work in accordance to these guidelines, we will pay you more for each patient. And you will say, yay. But in the end of the day, you will find that implementing these guidelines takes about 3 minutes more per patient, because you now need to talk about prevention, for example. So if you're paid, not as a person, but your hospital is actually surviving on the fact that you get paid per patient, which is the case in Sweden. You get paid for each patient that you have. Some of people are nodding. In order to still fit in the guidelines, you need that extra payment. So it's not that you're going to benefit, but you need that in order to secure your balance, your financial balance. But as soon as you talk about things like the carrot and the stick, have you heard that expression? That's what you use. It's actually economic theories behind that. How do you get people to do what you want them to do? That's the theory of from the economics field. If we move into the organizational theory, it's a lot about understanding knowledge management. Moving up, we think about the fact that we talked about yesterday. How do you actually interact with other people in learning how to implement the new guidelines, which is the evidence that you want to implement? And for example, I was giving to the table I was sitting with, I was saying that social networks, how do they influence the implementation? When you want something to happen, if you want to promote a new guideline, who do you talk to in your department? If you think that, for example, oh, okay, I'll go and talk to Marcus, or I go and talk to Sarah, because they will get things going. Think about, do you pick Marcus and Sarah because they're opinion leaders? Then you have a theory in your background. Professional development, is that what you, when you approach your colleagues, say that this you really need to do because it's part of your professional development? You have a theory in your background. You base your statement on a theory. Leadership, why do we have leaders? To lead. Why do we need leaders? We're autonomous people. Why do we have leaders? Because we have a theory that it's good to have someone lead. But if we believe that we as individuals do our very best, very rational, every day in every decision, why do we need leaders?
So you can't also drive something.
Yeah, but why can't the team do that? So there's a clash in between the theories of leadership and the theories of team effectiveness. Think about that. Moving further up, we're on the individual level. And most of the time, we think more about the individuals than the other ones, but we do need to recognize that there are a lot of theories that actually influence the organizations and the practice that we carry out every day. So at the individual level, we can, for example, say that how do people learn? Most of the time we come back, we are at a conference learning about guidelines, for example. We come back and we say, hey, listen, I've learned this. This is evidence-based practice. We should do it. Why do you do that? Because you believe, you use a theory that people are rational. And once they hear the reasoning behind using the guidelines, they will adhere to that and recognize and say, yeah, of course. Well, think about it. How rational are we really? If you read in the paper this morning that there was a new evidence saying that a glass of wine every day is very good for you, would you like that evidence? Most people would say yeah. Yeah. If you read evidence that says that before you drink that glass of wine, you need to run around the block, you will think, oh, that's crap evidence. How on earth did they really do that study? And you will start criticizing that evidence from the very start. Is that rational? We're not rational. If we would have been rational, we probably wouldn't be here. We are not prone to change, and that's probably how we survived as humans, because we have a lot of things that we are not as... there are lots of things with humans that are not as good as with other animals, but we can still survive because we are the way we are. We have a brain, and it's not prone to change. I'm going to show you that. So what does theories help us do in evidence-based or in implementation science? We help them to describe or guide the knowledge implementation process. We help them to we use them to understand what influences implementation outcomes, and we use them for evaluation. That's where we use the theories. Just so you know, if you read implementation science, you will run into theories. This is how we use them. Okay? This is actually one of the theories that has had a lot of influence on implementation science, and it's Everett Rogers. And he started doing his research in the US on farmers. And he learned, have you heard about Everett Rogers? He's quite common even in people who haven't read about implementation science. He suggested that when you meet a new innovation, that could be new knowledge, this is what happens in your brain. You take that knowledge and you process it, and you decide whether or not, am I going to accept this or not? So you reject it or accept it, and if you accept it, you're going to trial it in your own brain, and once you find that it's actually fitting into your knowledge altogether, and it actually makes sense, that's when you're going to have confirmed knowledge, and that's probably when you have really implemented it into your daily practice. But this is what happens in every individual once we are presented with some new information. This is what happens in your brain. And I can see on your faces whether or not you're rejecting or accepting, because this is tricky. And once you find this is way over my head and it's so tricky, you'll probably reject it, and I can see that happen. The funny thing about this is that once you have rejected something, it's probably more hard to be presented with it again. You start at a different point because your brain has already told you a number of things why you shouldn't listen to this. So the running around the blocks is already rejected, so you will start at a more negative starting point than if you heard it the first time. I don't know very much about your guidelines, but I can say that, for example, hand hygiene. Ever heard about hand hygiene? Yeah. It's about 150 years since we learned that we should wash our hands. in healthcare? Do we do it? Not enough. Why don't we do it enough? Sorry? It irritates your skin more? Time? More? Forgot it, yes. More? Lazy? More? Sorry? Pressure. Yeah. Pressure to do something else. And the fact that your colleagues may think that, oh, you're washing your hands a lot. Did you do a course? Bullying. Bullying. Some people think they don't need to, yeah. Okay, so you got a number of things. 150 years later, you got a number of reasons why you don't do evidence-based practice. So what makes you think that you're going to succeed in implementing the guidelines? We have so much evidence on why hand washing is good. So what makes you think that you're going to implement the guidelines from the ESC? Because you have good teaching. Good, thank you. This is another framework, and it's not called a theory because it's not substantiated enough, but it's a framework, so it means that it's in theory, a theory in building. And it's called the Promoting Action on Research Implementation in Health Services. It's most people from the UK has probably heard about it. It originates from a group of nurses who developed it 20 years ago, almost 15 years ago was the first paper on it. And it says to secure implementation of evidence into practice, you need to recognize 3 core domains. And these 3 core domains do correspond to each other. So in order to succeed, you need to recognize what you're going to implement, the evidence, where you're going to implement it, that's the context, and how you facilitate that implementation. And that looks fairly easy, isn't it? But when we talk about the evidence to start with, how is it processed? Will people start arguing with you about the evidence base of the evidence? You are lucky because someone has put together that evidence for you in these guidelines. But you will still meet colleagues that do as you did when I asked you, why don't you implement it? They have 100 reasons why not. And one of them will be, are you sure that evidence is really good? And they will spend hours looking at the evidence base of the evidence in order to not to have to change. That's how we people are. We will try our best to reject change because that's it's more easy to go doing what you do today. But you have the evidence. Do you know anything about your context? Do you know anything about what works in that kind of context? Where would you find the evidence on what works in what particular context? And the context is the people, the individuals, the teams, the professionals, and the level of autonomy within the professional groups, the leadership, the organization, the national legislations, the organizations that you have on a national and local, regional level, everything that, and the patient is part of the context. So the context is combined by all these aspects or factors that actually makes up a quite tricky situation Because when you want to understand what works for whom in what context, you need to listen to and recognize all these different parts. What makes us think that this works in this particular context because of this facilitation? You need to understand, how did this relate to the individuals, to the team, to the professionals, to the organization, etc. Because the third core component or domain is the facilitation. How do you really facilitate? And that's where we go head in most of the time, thinking that if, as I said, if I'm just pedagogical enough, if I do the teaching good, if I get people to listen, they will be adopting and implementing things. Or not. We hope they will, but we have limited knowledge of why that happens. When does it happen? Why and why not? Another theory, which is also at this time a model, which means that I've talked about theories, frameworks, and models. Models is a combination of different theories. And this is a model, and it's quite new, as you can see. It's based again on other theories that's combined into the healthcare science and implementation science field. So this is about what do we know about leadership and how can leaders promote change? How can leaders facilitate change? And the funny thing about that most people that are leaders, how many are leaders in here? Those of you who say you're leaders, why would you say you're leaders? Because you have a management position? Yeah, okay. I was expecting everyone to raise their hands. Because as nurses, in relation to the patient, you're considered a leader. As nurses, in relation to society, we should be leaders. We should lead the implementation of better evidence in promotion, prevention, and in self-care management and everything. So next time, raise your hand. This is the latest evidence on what we know about leaders is that in leadership, in order to implement change, or facilitate implementation. Facilitate is to support that change happening. So moving from diffusion, dissemination, and adoption to implementation. Facilitating is about helping that trajectory, is that an English word? Or okay. Move to actually implementation. We need, as leaders, to adopt these three types of behaviors and use them in combination. And that's why I started this seminar with actually saying, how prone are you to change yourself? Because most of us, if we are in a management position, we will either prefer a relations-oriented leadership or a task-oriented leadership. That's usually what we prefer doing. Very few of us are change-oriented by fault. But the evidence today says that we need to adopt and combine these three together, which means that as soon as you become a leader of change, as Machiavelli said, you need to live the change yourself. So once anyone in your organization comes back from a conference saying, hey, listen, I heard this, you need to act on it as, tell me more, and not tell me, and not say, as you usually say, yeah, I've heard that before. Didn't work last time. Have you ever said that? Yeah, I could have. Could have. Okay, the sponge cake. Sometimes it turns out like this, sometimes it turns out like this. Yeah. What is it that happens? When does it work and why doesn't it work?
Because you didn't follow the instructions completely. Maybe your oven was too hot
Yeah.
or too cold.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah. Maybe you didn't follow the recipe. Maybe you didn't do all the activities. So what we know about the facilitating implementation activities, we will come back to that. But most of all, we have to understand that behind the activities, there are mechanisms. So the fact that you actually whip the eggs and sugar, all of you who made a sponge cake know that you have to whip quite hard for some time, but not for too long, because what happens is that you actually beat in air into that part. And when you do that, you prolong the proteins in the egg. So you build in air. You want air into the batter, okay? Then you also know that once you have put in the milk and the baking powder combined with the flour, you know that there's going to be a chemical reaction between the liquid and the baking powder. And in order for that to complete to be in the entire cake and not just part of it, you need to make sure that the baking powder is spread throughout. That's why you mix the flour and the baking powder and make sure that it's all over the place. Because that's when the chemical reaction can actually happen throughout the whole cake. Okay? You also know that if you put the butter in, the batter, is that butter and batter? You understand what I'm saying? Okay, sorry. I should have done this in Swedish. At least some people would have understood what I said. 3, I think. If it's hot, that's going to ruin the whole chemical process happening. It needs to be cool. You also know, if you've done this a couple of times and ended up like on the left, you also know that if the phone rings at this particular time point, you cannot answer the phone. Because the chemical reaction is actually a twin reaction. So the first chemical reaction is the air and the baking powder and the liquid that makes the chemical process. Then when you put it in the oven, that's a second duplicate, because the heat will make the baking powder react again. So it's actually twice that the baking powder reacts. That means that you know that you can't go opening the oven door because the temperature will drop, and that's going to ruin the whole second chemical process, the mechanism. So if you do all this, the activities, there are actually things happening behind the scene, and that's what makes that. And what does that have to do with implementation science? We know this when we do a sponge cake. We don't know. We hope this is going to happen when we implement new things like guidelines. We hope, because we haven't mapped the whole process. We haven't mapped what's going to happen. But when we do this and we end up, we start our sponge cake and we find out, oh shoot, sorry, but the baking, I'm out of baking powder, so I take baking soda instead. When you do that, you also know that you need to exchange the milk for a sour liquid, because baking soda will only have this chemical reaction when it's a lower pH. You know that? Yeah. So you will take juice or anything else. You won't take milk because you know it's going to end up like that. You know this when you make sponge cakes. If you are going to implement new guidelines into a team where you have baking soda instead of baking powder, you need to make sure that you take a sour liquid. That means a facilitation strategy that works together with the baking soda. Why is it that we're better cooks than facilitators? Because it's tricky. I understand, I know, believe me, you won't believe how my forehead looks. Okay, so what do we need to do? This is basic. You know this. This is how you do it. This is actually how you do it. These are the activities. You start by planning, then you do it, then you follow up, and then you act on the follow-up. Have you done this? Have you really? So how come you say that you hope they're going to be implemented? If you've done this properly, you would know what to do to facilitate the change. I do challenge you, I know that, and it's early in the morning, but I'm here to do that.
But it depends on the people as well that you're involved with.
Yeah.
You might have all these in place, but then if there are other people on your team that
Yeah.
maybe are...
The baking powder or the baking
Exactly,
soda, yeah, it is. Go home and make sponge cakes. The thing is, someone was mentioning Ian Graham yesterday. Who's that?
Mention what?
Ian Graham.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Have you
First
worked with him?
guidelines. Yes.
Yeah. Good. Because he, I do too, and he's a very important person in implementation science. And he sort of took the PDSA cycle and developed it more for what's it really like to secure that the knowledge gets into action. And the funny thing about that is that you already, some people in healthcare have to start in the middle. They have to understand what evidence is it really that we need to implement. You don't have to do that. The guidelines are there. Someone's done it for you. So you can go straight at implementing them. It's tricky enough, but you can start there. But others really have to start from the very beginning, saying that, okay, so what's the evidence that we're going to implement anyway? Where is it? Is it there? Do we need to understand it better and tailor it? The tailoring you still need to do at home, but you don't need to do the knowledge synthesis. That's a tricky one. I won't say it. It says in the middle. And someone has done that for you. So you can go home and start practicing. But most of the time, we actually think this way. So this is our, most of the time, then a miracle occurs. Should be a little bit more specific right there. We wrote a paper, a couple of us wrote a paper on this was published this year, early this year. And in that paper, we try to understand what is it that makes it tricky. And we suggest that it's about the evidence in actually two parts. Because it could be that you rely heavily on the evidence for the clinical intervention. And you are, again, very lucky because you have evidence to rely on in your practice because of the guidelines. You do have evidence in terms of the clinical intervention. What is it that you should do for what kind of patient or patients, and why should you do that? Thank you for those guidelines. Did you say thank you? Oh, good. So you are in one of the top boxes. You have good evidence for what you're going to do in terms of clinic, okay? But do you know how to do it? Do you know how to implement it? What's the evidence for the implementation intervention that you are using? How do you do implementation? Do you most of the time use, you think that, okay, I'm going to implement these guidelines, so I book a room and I get everyone in there and then I tell them to do that? I tell them about the guidelines. I try and my best to sell how good they are. Most of the time I would say that's what people do, because they can check the box and say, tick the box and say, oh, I've done implementation. No, you haven't. You diffuse the information. And sorry to say, that is not evidence-based implementation intervention in terms of implementing things. It's a very good idea, a very, very, very good idea in terms of sharing information, sharing knowledge, but it's not evidence-based as facilitating implementation, facilitating change. Sorry. You need to do more. Most of the time, I would say that we are not in the top right corner, because most of the time we don't have, this is the clinical evidence that we're going to use, and this is the evidence on how to implement it. Most of the time, we're not there. I would say you're probably in that scenario C box, where you know what to implement, but you don't have the evidence on how to implement it. What is it that works in order to implement that? Do argue with me if I'm totally off track. But what I've heard so far, you're a scenario C. In other nursing areas, and even in other allied health professionals, what they do, they may even be in the lower boxes. So it could be that we have very little evidence on terms of the clinical intervention, and we don't know how to do it in terms of implementing it. Then we have to start with the Graham knowledge to action and start identifying the evidence, and then we can do the implementation. Please have a look at that paper. It's kind of an overview and a discussion about what is it that you need to understand. Another way of doing that is, if you take this picture, this is from the Medical Research Council guidelines, and it's becoming more and more popular actually I need to leave the microphone because I will need to go there. This is how we usually do things. We do an intervention and we measure the outcomes. We do an intervention and we measure the outcomes. And then we come back and we'll say, oh yeah, something happened. Oh, I made a sponge cake. Wonder how that happened. I would suggest when you do the PDSA cycle, do recognize that you need to understand and map the context and the process, as well as the intervention and the outcomes. Because that will help you better understand what worked, for whom did it work, why did it work, or why didn't it work, so that next time you do it, you're more informed, more and better informed. That means that you need to map your whole implementation process, but you also need to map what mechanism was triggered in that particular context because of those implementation activities and because of that clinical intervention. Again, think about the sponge cake. Not only note down what you did, how long time did you whip the egg and sugar, but also map down how much did it rise. What did you do while the cake was in the oven? Did you open the door or not? Was the temperature really 175 degrees, or was it a bit lower or a bit higher? You need to map that in order to understand why on earth did I actually succeed in implementing or this guideline or making a sponge cake. I'm sort of running out of time, but I need to check whether or not I'm also actually getting to the end of my seminar. because I got now the 7 minutes, I think. Have I lost you? Are you back home now thinking about how you're going to do this? Sponge cakes. Sponge cakes, yeah. So I will tell you something about my experience about sponge cakes, because I've been doing this for 25 years, and the last 10 years, as I said, I've been doing this more or less full-time as a researcher, which means that I've done implementation and studied implementation in a number of contexts. I've learned that in a particular context, a particular facilitation strategy could work for a particular kind of evidence that's going to be implemented. But in a different context, the same facilitation strategy will not work. So bottom line of this, I've learned that if you pay attention to these 3 core components or key domains, you will actually understand something. Which means that the process evaluation suggested by Moore and colleagues, according to the MRC, please pay attention to them because they work. You will be a lot more informed and a better facilitator the next time if you do pay attention, not only to the evidence and how you implement it, but how you facilitate it and in what particular context that facilitation strategy worked. Please use evidence as a basis for your facilitation strategy. Do not just take anything off the shelf. Think about, why do I pick this particular kind of strategy to facilitate? Use theory to understand, why do I do this? Did it work the last time? What is it in this particular context that made me think of this? Is it because I want to tick off my box saying that I've done something, or do you really want to facilitate the implementation? Because if you want to facilitate the implementation and help others adhere to evidence-based practice, you need to be more careful about what you pick and why you pick that. You need to get people on board. The managers can be, as we said yesterday, a barrier, but they can also help facilitate. But that depends on what they get from you as a facilitator and how you recognize their behaviors and help them behave in a way that they can actually support the change. As opposed to myself and my colleagues, we have 1,000 million consultants out there in terms of people who work for companies that sell project management. They will probably behave in one of two ways. The one is to say that if you just use our project management device, you will succeed in implementing these guidelines. Do not believe them. That's not true. Or they will say, this is so tricky, so you need to buy our services so that we can come and facilitate the implementation. Do not believe it, because we know from science that the best and most sustainable implementation is facilitated by people from within the organization, not from without or outside. You can fly in people that are very enthusiastic and sort of fire up for project, but that's not how you implement change and make sure that it's sustainable. We did a project in Vietnam on neonatal mortality. It took us, the first year nothing happened. We had facilitators facilitating the implementation of evidence-based guidelines. First year nothing happened, second year nothing happened, third year 50% decrease in neonatal mortality. 50%, almost 50, it was 47 point something. That's a lot of kids that had died in vain before. 3 years. The PDSA cycle is most often used only as PD. The SA is left out because people are bored and something new is coming, and most people don't stick with change. Because when they're rejected, most of us will say, okay, no, that was too hard, and they didn't like me, so let's do another thing. There are, Susan Mickey and her colleagues at University College London have a number of papers on changing behaviors. They've identified at least 93 techniques for changing behaviors. 93 techniques. There are over 100 implementation theories, models, frameworks available out there. I've named 3. But do recognize that there are more out there to understand what's going to happen. Sustainability and perseverance, I was quoting Winnie the Pooh there, because they're quite tricky words, but they're about the change and how long time it takes to actually make implementation. I've listed a number of references as suggested reading, and also what I've been quoting in this presentation, and that's my last slide. Do you know who this is? It's Joan of Arc.
Oh.
In manga format. Joan of Arc. You know her?
Yes.
Yeah. She's coming with me to every lecture that I give, because I believe that you have to have some of her spirit in order to actually facilitate implementation of any evidence. She was said to be about 12 years old, and she did not think of herself, why should I? She went to the French king and said, listen, I can make you win over the Brits in the war, wasn't it? And she succeeded. I find that a lot of nurses say someone else should make the change. It's not for us to make the change. Someone else should facilitate the change. Don't believe them. Think of Joan of Arc. You can do it. And I promise you, you will not be burned as she was. We don't do that anymore. I'm still alive, even though I think some people would have preferred me not being. But that's it. That's my end point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're still alive after all that banging of your head.
Yes, I am. Yeah.
But just you mentioned Ian Graham earlier on, and I've heard him speak several times, and he will say that as nurses are the best at implementing guidelines.
Yeah.
So I think we should take that on board as well, and believe that we can do it.
Yeah.
But I was just interested there, and I know we had the conversation on the bus on the way up about de-implementing.
Yes.
And I found that interesting because, as you said, we don't often think about that.
No.
So, I just.
Can I have a few minutes?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, please.
Thank
Expand.
you. Expand. Yes. We don't. Yes, as you say, we don't often think about de-implementation. But once we come with evidence, shouldn't it be that we automatically think that, okay, so what's the old stuff that we should take out? Because part of the stress in healthcare today is that we don't take the old stuff out. We don't tell people what is it that you shouldn't do anymore. And some of it is actually going to be sort of covering up the fact that people don't really implement the new stuff. They try, or they behave as if they have done that, but they keep doing in daily practice what they've done before. Because that's safe. So if you say that you're going to run around the block before you drink that glass of wine, people will actually say, yeah, but they won't know. They won't know. So I will still drink my glass of wine, but I won't running around. I'm not going to run around the block, and they won't know. That's how many health professionals, I work with many, believe me, especially we did one study in rehabilitation post-stroke in primary care. And when we approached the leaders, we said we want to see if we can, if this implementation strategy is going to work to facilitate the implementation of these national guidelines for rehabilitation post-stroke. And the managers that we approached said, sure, you can do that in our organization, but it's already implemented. You know, it's already implemented, but please feel free, do it. And we were like, yeah, sure. And we went in there, and you know what? We found physiotherapists doing things that were ruled out as evidence 30 years ago. They still did it. So when you do a de-implementation, you have to recognize that, one, you have to do it. Two, you need to be aware that when people are approached with, this is the new evidence, and the old evidence, or whatever you based your daily practice on, is not valid anymore. You need to be a bit humble when you approach people, because most health professionals go to their jobs to do a good job for patients. So you need to recognize the professional pride in what they've done so far was the best that they had, but now they can't do it that way anymore. You need to de-implement as well.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Catrine?
I agree with the last one you said, that they mean
Only the
good.
last one.
No. I'll start
Sorry.
with the
Yeah,
last
okay.
one.
Yeah, thank you.
They mean good.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not that they only learn new information and they have to implement it. As you said earlier, they need to change their culture. And I think this is one of the most difficult things that we need to do. And it's the same, not only with our colleagues, but we see this difficulty with the patients most of the time.
Yeah.
We know that they need to exercise, they need to change their diets, we inform them, we educate them, but something else is needed in order to adherence.
Yeah.
And most of the time we see that it's not only the education, the information, it's the culture we need to change. So we need to focus on that.
Yeah.
It's a behavior change, and we need to focus on that and find all this way and all these models that you have already presented that we actually need to change.
That's a good point, because what you do is that you think you implement, but what you do is that you diffuse or disseminate information. How can you help your patients to actually adopt and implement?
And it's the same thing
It's
for
the same
us.
thing. Yeah, it is. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments, please? So,
Okay.
I think
Thank you.
that was great. Thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
that. And we, I think, are all going home with a little bit more knowledge about implementing guidelines.
And the last slide is my email address.
Oh, good.
So
Thank
if
you.
you want to have a contact, I can either, maybe you want to have a contact with someone in your country that actually does this, and I can see if there are colleagues that I know of that actually do implementation science, because you may want to have a researcher on board to help you understand why is it working and why not. I know that most people think researchers are a pain, but we can actually help in this.
Thank you. And
Thank
we
you.
can pass on your slides as well. Okay.